Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nicole from the Institute of Banking and Finance, and I'm delighted that you're able to join us this afternoon for this IBF Masterclass jointly organized with the Institute for Mergers, Acquisitions and Alliances on how to ensure integration success in a record M&A transaction environment. We're glad to have with us today Alexander Bari, co-founder, managing director at IMAA, David Boyd, and Ben D. Heldebang, partners at the Agile Gorilla, to share their knowledge today. Before I get them to share their insights, for those who may be unfamiliar with IBF, allow me to do a very brief intro on us and the resources we have to help professionals in the financial industry. IBF was established by the MAS in 1974 as a training provider to provide functional training for the financial industry. Since then, our role has evolved into one of standard setting for financial services sector skills and competencies. In August 2018, our mandate was expanded to cover career advisory and job matching functions for the financial services sector. We were also appointed the Jobs Development Partner for the financial services sector last year by the Jobs Development Council and now oversee both skills and jobs development in the financial industry in Singapore. Here's a quick look at our services and how we support the industry across training, recruitment, and workforce transformation. You can find out more about our services and connect with us on any of these areas via our website. The enhanced course fee subsidies, which are part of MAS's support package to encourage companies to send their employees for training and upskilling, will continue to be in place until 30th June this year. Training costs under IBF recognized programs will be at 80% for trainees below 40, while remaining at 90% for trainees above the age of 40, before going back down to pre-crisis levels starting from July this year. Training allowance grant support will also remain in place to encourage companies to continue spending on their staff for training until June. You can also find more details on the enhanced training support on our website. You can find the list of eligible training programs on the IBF Program Finder on our website as well. In addition, IBF will also be supplementing the commercial training available with free webinars such as this during this period to support the training needs of the industry. Finance professionals can also tap on the Learn at IBF Learning app for bite-sized learning at your own leisure. All these are complimentary and are accorded with CPD hours. That concludes my short intro. I'm going to hand the time over to Alexander now.
Thank you very much, and a very warm welcome also from my side. My name is Alexander Bari, and I'm the Managing Director of the IMAA Institute. Today's topic is, today's masterclass is the unwritten rules of M&A, why they continue to destroy value and need to be challenged. And I'm happy to introduce our speakers for today, as well as giving you a brief introduction about what you're going to expect from this masterclass and yeah, basically the content of today's presentation. As I mentioned, my name is Alexander Bari. I'm the Managing Director from the IMAA Institute, and we are joined today by our lovely friends from the Agile Gorilla, true post-merge integration specialists and experts, David Boyd and Ben de Heldebang, who are both partners of the Agile Gorilla, who will will share their insights about their experiences when it comes to post-merge integration. And then I will also be joined by my colleague Feriani from our Singapore office, who is going to explain a bit about the funding structure for post-merge integration trainings with the IBF and the our institute. And at the end, of course, we will be very open to have a lively discussion with all participants, and we will have a Q&A session. Just a bit about our speakers today from the Agile Gorilla. Just want to, both of them are going to introduce them shortly as well, but just to give you a brief insight about what David Boyd and Ben de Heldebang have been doing for, let's say, the past years already, many years of post-merge integration experience. In this webinar today, David Boyd has been working for PwC for many years, more than more than 20 years of M&A integration project experience, has been writing the methodology for PwC London for post-merge integration with two other colleagues, and is a true expert in those kind of transformation processes, as well as Ben de Haldewang, who initially started as an executive search manager, having identified that especially people from the investment and banking sector were easily kind of extracted from their current positions as soon as a takeover was or a merger was taking place. So he quickly identified that there are a lot of issues involving the culture, the company culture, especially when it comes to the process of the integration or a takeover of a company. So we have a lot of experience here today, and I just want to give you also a brief insight about IMAA for the ones who don't know us yet. We consider ourselves to be the leading global think tank for mergers and acquisition, founded in 2004 by Professor Christopher Kummer, who himself was a PwC expert in that field, and then founded this institute by making sure that we really want to we want to be the knowledge base for people in the M&A space, providing trainings, and we want to not only provide trainings, but we want to be kind of a knowledge hub and provide resources to people who are involved in transactions and M&A projects. We have a global network with branch offices in Singapore, New York, Vienna, and Zurich, and we probably have largest M&A community worldwide, given the fact that we have more than 27,000 registered users who are in the M&A space on our homepage. We have more than 3,000 participants and charter holders who have done our certification already with our M&A trainings. We have from more than 70 countries. Those people originate from more than 70 countries. We have worked with more than 1,400 companies when it comes to train their staff. You will find more than 60 hours of faculty videos on our learning platform. And we are proud to have more than 100 faculty and M&A experts working with us and training people in that particular field. And another add-on for all our participants and users is that we have an extensive library of more than 130,000 books, including a lot of course, know-how in the M&A field. We've currently completed almost 60 on-site and virtual trainings, and we will have quite a number scheduled for this year as well, and also particularly also in Singapore, but Feriani will tell more about that at the end of our presentation. Of course, we are recognized by multiple institutions and accreditation bodies worldwide, as we believe that quality education is the key to success, and therefore we are very happy to provide different sorts of trainings, whether those are online, self-paced, virtually live in a Zoom environment as we're doing now, where you can really directly interact with the trainers, and hopefully soon again more and more on-site trainings. You can see here a picture, and many of you will recognize this. This is actually a picture of one of our last on-site trainings in Singapore, where we had our social event at night, and we are planning to do our first on-site, let's say, hopefully post-pandemic on-site in September this year again in Singapore, and where we hopefully can gather those professionals together and have a drink and do some networking again. And of course, last but not least, we do a lot of in-house trainings, tailored trainings for big corporations who want to tackle particular topics when it comes to transactions and M&A projects. So, but you can also see here just a little overview of the certification programs we currently offer. I would say the most generic one is our international M&A expert, international merger and acquisition expert training, and then what today's topic is targeting is our certified post-merge integration expert and specialist program, where you can see that those two are actually also IBF funded. So you can see that people who are Singaporeans or Singaporean residents, they can apply for the IBF funding scheme and get 90 or 80% funding from IBF when pursuing these certifications with us. We have also additional M&A certification programs like our legal M&A expert or M&A P for people who are more into the consultancy space, and our HR mergers and acquisition expert as well. All of those can be done either online, virtually, or on site. And now I'm very happy to hand over to our colleagues Ben and David from the Agile Gorilla, and they will tell a bit more about the unwritten rules of M&A. Thank you.
Fantastic. Alex, thanks very much for the introduction. Nicole, very much thank you too. I'm delighted to be speaking to my friends and colleagues in Singapore again. I spent 9 very happy years working in Singapore, came back in 2016, having gone out with PwC and then built a little consultancy business called P-Cubed. Some of you might be familiar with that. And it was a glorious place. In fact, looking at my background, it makes me slightly homesick, I have to say, not just because of the weather. I currently live on the east coast of Scotland. Since coming back from Asia, I've done a whole bunch of different things, and David has as well. I'll talk a little bit about David because he's very modest and he'll try and hide his blushes anyway. But so he after leaving PwC, he then went to run the digital content side at as a sort of project director at Clear Channel, which is a very large outdoor advertising business in 27 countries, and built that. I just saw on your LinkedIn bio that you built it from 200 to 20 to 200 million dollars worth of revenue, which is a remarkable thing, mainly through acquisition, I suspect. And then he and I worked together on a transaction with the London Stock Exchange, which was their first big deal post the failed acquisition of Deutsche Börse. So we spent 2.5 years very happily commuting between London, or Edinburgh in my case, and New York on that transaction, and built some skills. And since then, he's done another magnificent transformation of pharmaceutical consulting business from which he managed to sell to private equity on behalf of his own. So he's very good at this stuff. So my background, similarly, I've been running larger programs of work since coming back from Asia with the stock exchange, with insurance companies, and now in the offshore tech hub space as well. So yes, so M&A has been a preoccupation for me and for him for quite a long time, and so it should be, right? So I love the fact that when I talk to people about mergers and acquisitions, a lot of people still seem to think of it as being a bit of a niche activity. If you think about the fact that there were $4 trillion worth of transactions conducted in COVID year, last year, and that was a very small decrease from the year before. It's a pretty significant activity, and I expect all of you will have been involved in one or of these, and all of you will be involved in these going forward. If you add on to that there are about $7 trillion worth of transformation work expected over the next 3 years, the capability and capacity and the resources that are used for these two activities are pretty much the same. So we're talking about a very, very significant activity for most organizations going forward. And I know Asia has a slightly different dynamic in terms of some of the sort of more family-owned nature of the organization, certainly that middle level, but it's coming in Asia as well, and certainly my experience in Asia would suggest that that's the case. So on top of that large volume of work, we've also got a phenomenon in Europe, and I think in Asia as well, around employee engagement, which is that it is at an all-time low. According to the last Gallup survey, something like 85% of the employees were active or disengaged with their employers. So the very group of people that we're trying to persuade to do things perhaps from the side of the desk, which is typically the approach that organizations take with regard to M&A activity, are less and less willing to do that. And then on top of that, we've got, according to the Harvard Business Review, a failure rate of between 70 and 90% still of transactions not delivering its value. So it's a very challenging story and market that we're talking to, and debate and conversation that we're going to have today. And for David and me, I speak on his behalf, I do not want my tombstone to read, he spent 25 years or 30 years of his life working in a sector which continued to destroy rather than create value. Let's be honest, right? That's not a good epitaph for anyone. So part of the challenge that he and I have gone through, and Dave will talk a bit about Agile Gorilla in a moment, is to really think about some of those unwritten rules that everyone seems to buy into at the start of an M&A transaction, but haven't really been challenged for quite a long time. And we think at the heart of those rules are probably some of the reasons why we're destroying value so actively in the process. So the structure of this conversation is going to be, we're going to go through these 5 rules. There are more, but these are the 5 main ones that we've pulled out. David and I are going to sort of swap between ourselves to explain the rule, talk about why it's a rule, talk about what the issues are that sit behind that rule, and then perhaps challenge it and come up with a different way of approaching the subject. We're then going to have a very brief 1 or 2 minute conversation between ourselves about some questions around that area. Obviously encourage you to have some questions there as well, and then we'll move on from there. There is time at the end for Q&A. I think Nicole mentioned it, so we've got at least 15 minutes at the end for Q&A, which I think will come through the chat space. So I look forward to hearing all your intelligent questions and penetrating questions through that process. I know when I deal with the Singaporean audience that we get a lot of that. Alex, if you can carry on managing these slides for me, that would be fantastic. That way I don't have to do 2 things at once, because I end up, as we all know, most men aren't able to do that. So I quite like it. If you manage that for me, that'd be great. Perfect. So David, over to you just to talk a bit about Agile Gorilla. Shall we move on the slides a wee bit? Actually, that'd be good to Alex.
There we go. Thanks, Ben. So Ben and I have done this many times with many different companies and many different consultancies. 20 years experience of doing post-merger integration as independents with big firms. Ben actually started a long time ago a specialist consultancy on post-merger integration, which he then sold to PwC, which is how I met him. And when we got together, this is about 5 years ago now, we really just felt, as he said about the tombstone, that deals are sold on, and post-merger integration programs are sold on fear, that deals fail, and that you need a team of independent experts, consultants to come in and sort things out. And the problems of that creates are just so significant. We're going to walk through some of those today with you and try and give you our overview of what we see the perspective of the industry. Because for us, actually, we believe you should use your own people, not use consultants. Your people are the best people to deliver the deal. We think that things should be built around customer insight. Actually, it's really understanding of the marketplace. It's not about understanding of the P&L. It's understanding of your customers that you really need to drive the integration. So much of it is pre-planned, we're going to talk through. And actually, we feel that it needs to be an agile approach. It needs to be emergent. It needs to evolve. And I suppose fundamentally, Ben and I are optimistic about people, and that we see that the people in an organization and the culture as enablers for the change rather than barriers to change, which they so often are in any kind of methodology. So there's so much power and so much opportunity in M&A, and yet we still believe fundamentally in many different areas people are getting them wrong. And so we'll walk through 5 of the big ones for you today. So it's me starting you off. And the first thing I talk through is this focus on cost synergies being worth more than revenue synergies. We'll then, as Ben said, do 3 or 4 more. There's a bit of discussion as we go on. Cost synergies. Sorry, Alex, if you wouldn't mind moving on to the next one. It's the biggest frustration for me is this real focus on cost to an extreme through the deal. And I suppose it's very sensible. I mean, there are clearly, from the work that you do in the data room, big cost synergies and cost elements to consider as you go through a project and a post-merger integration. Why is that so? Well, the people who are running the program typically have that kind of cost and consultant kind of background. They're working from the information from the data room, which is the historic data, which will naturally signal the kind of cost opportunities you'd expect to see. When you're then starting to think through the M&A model and the business case going forward, you're really thinking through, okay, there's a time value of money there. So anything which you start to discount things through in terms of the NCF, those kind of financial calculations to look at the value, naturally the things that deliver the benefit in the first few months, such as a cost saving will come up more significantly in the business case. Other element, the kind of final element here is really around the risk adjustments then. So when you get the team of people from the very much financial side looking down through the business model and saying, okay, what's the value here from the deal, they'll be risk adjusting anything they feel slightly less comfortable with. And that always hits the revenue synergies more significantly. That all makes sense. It all makes kind of good logic why you'd want to do that. But actually, that has really negative implications in terms of how kind of things work forward. So I'll just move on to the next point. There we go. So just get control of the screen. Brilliant. Thank you for that, Alex. So why is this an issue? Well, the problem is timing as well. So all through that deal process, you have been working on some assumptions and some high-level data you've got from the data room, that really understanding the business, getting your hands into it, talking to people in more detail in that real kind of honest and open environment. So when you hit the company to start with on day one and in the first 100 days and start making those cost cuts, actually you haven't really understood the growth opportunities from that company. And the risk there is actually you move the capacity and the capability you need for growth. I've got a great example for this just from a recent program. I did a turnaround for a client which was integrating hundreds of different independent businesses in one go. They started the program by seeing an opportunity to reduce the resources and capacity and number of people within the marketing and comms function. As soon as that was done, they then went on to the next element of the program, which is actually building all the organization into a single brand. As soon as they started that program, they realized that actually the resources and capabilities they needed were all around marketing communications, both for the external market to tell the story of the change, but then also the internal organization to take everyone with them. And they just sacked all the people and removed all the budgets for the marketing and comms capability. So actually understanding that future opportunity, the real big opportunity here, which was all to come together as one organization, as one brand, actually they just removed all the capability they needed to do that. Behind that is this challenge you're working with, again, from the data room, that people don't do what it says on my job description. You come up with some theories and some ideas about what the organization will change, but actually you really need to understand the different people and the roles they play in an organization. That could be significantly different from what you expect. The final thing for me, which I suppose underlines it all, is just as important as everything else, is this circular nature of the cost cut. M&A can be such a big change for an organization. When you signal to everyone that the main focus is internal, the main focus is on reducing cost, then people start to feel scared for their own role, become internally focused, be concerned about their budgets for their department going forward. And so that internal kind of focus of the organization then removes the growth opportunities that you'd like people to focus on, and actually then leads to kind of poor performance as they become distracted and internally focused on those kind of silos and organizations you've got. That then means to get further increased profit, you need to make further cost cuts. And that kind of negative cycle we've seen happen so many different times. So what do you do about this? For us, as I said at the start, integration needs to be outward looking. It needs to be based on customer insight. To do that, actually, you need to create time for yourself. So actually post-deal, you need that time to evaluate those revenue opportunities before you make the cost cuts. You need to set that kind of understanding in the organization that what you're trying to achieve here is growth, not purely that profit from cost synergies. And one of the elements to do that is by creating a kind of transparency in the organization rather than taking control. Often the first thing that consultancies will advise an acquirer to do is take control of that target organization. And that kind of taking control away from the people that have been running the business historically can really damage the trust. So again, create transparency rather than taking control. When you're thinking about who to use in your integration team, we'd say actually, rather than looking at the people you know in your organization as an acquirer, actually go to those people in the target organization. They understand the clients, they understand the market, they understand their opportunities and their products. Actually, it's quite easy for them to learn your systems and processes, get them involved, leading the integration team, running the integration team, and that will really help. And the final element is a great way of signaling this. If you really want to say to people, we're a client-focused organization, the best way of doing that is how you spend the first day in the organization. If everyone is clear that you as leaders in the company or you as key people in the organization are spending the first day where after deal completion and you're out there talking to clients, that will signal a real big cultural change in the organization. Ben.
That's great stuff, David. Yeah, I'm going to come to you now. I'm going to quick devil's advocate question. So I am the M&A director of a major Southeast Asian business. Just bought a business in the Philippines, and 6 months ago, or maybe a year ago, I declared to my shareholders that I was going to be able to achieve, X million of cost synergy through taking people out of duplicate functions. And now you're telling me that I'm not going to be able to do that for the first 6 months of the process. How do I position that to my shareholders? How do I get to the right place to follow your very sensible suggestion?
It's a really good challenge, and I think so often we do fall into that trap of making an external commitment to a cost saving with a very short timeline. There's almost an expectation externally that's what you're going to do. I think my experience is real understanding out there amongst stakeholders and shareholders when you say, actually, what we're going to do from this organization is we're going to grow the business. And so you do have to avoid that PR communication saying this is the cost synergy we're achieving and in this time frame, but you are able to replace that with actually we're going to be more customer focused. We see massive opportunities in this sector. That's what we're going after. And almost it's really important to do that, because if you say externally it's all about cost synergies and then you make these changes internally, it won't really stack up for the employees. I don't think you'll get that trust amongst people. So actually the signaling externally does need to be, this is a growth opportunity we're going after.
Very good. Okay. Shall we move on? Are you in control of the slides though?
I am.
Fantastic. Let us move on to functional teams to lead the way. Okay, so if we go to the next slide then. So since time immemorial, certainly since I was born anyway, the way that integration structure has been structured has been through functions. And just to be clear, what I mean by that, finance, HR, risk, legal, compliance, operations, R&D, sales, marketing, all those wonderful functions that we all got very familiar with in terms of our organizations, is how integration has been run up until now. If you go to the next slide, the reason why is pretty obvious. It reflects the organizational structure of most businesses. So I haven't come across very many. There are some, and they're quite notable. Organizations that are less functionally led than that. If you go into the entrepreneurial space, you'll find businesses that are very much outcome focused or around the purpose of the business. But generally, we grow our careers in functions. It's very clear that activities like this, you could almost say that M&A or post-merger integration or PMO type functions are also functions where functional expertise has been established and people have spent a lot of time building their careers in those functions. And therefore, to lose that expertise seems to be a mistake. If we go down it. Certainly, the resource space. For most of you, I suspect your careers will be largely determined by your success within a function, whether you're an accountant going into the finance function or a salesperson going into the sales function. And I think the last one, and probably this is the one that I would distribute the most, is that if we do it in functions, at least we all know what that looks like, and that minimizes our disruption in the way that we operate. The reason why I question that is because change, as we all know, is a massive disruptor. The great example I use all the time is, everyone talks about being fantastic at change. the reality is that no one's really very good at change. I think for most of you, perhaps if any of you recently gone to the office, I suspect even before, and perhaps before COVID might be the right rule to take, I suspect you didn't take a different route from the day before, just for the sake of the experience. You know, that's not something that we typically do, right? And if I asked you more personal questions about, you know, what you had for breakfast this morning, again, I have one notable colleague who used to love having something different every morning for breakfast. She is Singaporean, but as made by her husband, actually. You know? But for most of us, we have the same thing for breakfast in the morning. We don't vary between coffee and tea just because it's a Tuesday and a Wednesday. So actually, our approach to change is pretty much the same. We don't like it very much. So, so that's the normal structure. If we go next slide, then David. So what are the issues here? So the first issue is, are the interests of the functional leader the same as the interests of perhaps the CEO for the integration process? Let me give you an example. If I were the HR director of a business, I might have a very significant interest in improving my HR systems because, you know, they're not the bright and shiny thing that my colleagues, my contemporaries have, because there are you know, some issues with the way that the interface works with the ERP system, because it's not as easy for me to access the information that I need to access, right? Now, from the HR director, that might be a really sensible thing to do. For the CEO of the business, does changing an HR information system actually have any benefits with regard to the integration process? I would argue very rarely is that a significant benefit for the organization. In fact, if anything, it's just a distraction from what's going on. And I think you see that conflict of interest between function and the organization all over the place. Second question is, are we actually trying to get to operational efficiency and to some of those cost synergies perhaps within a function? Well, you know, you could say there's a bit of duplication that's taking place, but generally functions are run pretty tightly, right? There isn't enormous amount of excess resource and capacity within each function. It's part of the issues that we have when we look at resources around an integration process. That's not really the case. The reality is that the operational efficiency opportunity sits between functions, not within functions. I'll give you an example about that in a minute. And the last thing is, networks, which are actually the driving force of any integration process. I've always said, and many of you will have heard it before, that integration is a consequence of 1,000 conversations. Those networks are really significantly challenged when we're starting to just deal with things within the context of a function. So let's quickly give an example about the operational efficiency piece. Many years ago, some colleagues of mine and I were working on an integration in Malaysia with the sale of the ExxonMobil assets in both in terms of petrol stations and refinery and core functions to Petron, the large Philippines-owned oil and gas giant, if you like, and subsidiary of San Miguel. And what was fascinating about ExxonMobil was it was very much functionally driven, and it was almost ridiculously functionally driven. And I'll give you an example. What they were producing in terms of which grade of petrol was not defined by what the customer demand was, but it was defined by what the refinery wanted to produce, which is an extraordinary thing if you think about it. Perhaps I always think language is really interesting, and the optics for ExxonMobil was that they called sales distribution, which doesn't sound like very much a sort of customer engagement type exercise. It was very much a way of getting the product out the door. And so when we started to talk to them about getting some customer input into this process, what became very clear was that it needed the sort of cooperation of the refinery, of the sales function, and indeed of the actual stations themselves to work together to understand what data they would need and in what sort of time set they would need it to be able to change their production and make it efficient for that, and how to respond to that demand. It wasn't as though the data didn't exist within the petrol stations. The owners knew exactly what they were looking for. It just wasn't being filtered through the organization. And ultimately, we ended up with a sort of very broad cross-functional demand-based work stream, which said, okay, let's turn this back on its head and actually think about what we need from a demand point of view based on customer input and customer engagement as a process. So let's go to the next slide, David. So what could you do? So I think most transactions are based on outcomes. So I think I've very rarely seen a business case which says we are going to take 5%, 10% out of the HR function, 5-10% out of the finance function. There may be a conversation which says there are some cost synergies through overlaps, but the reality is that most deals are driven either by the ability and the opportunity to sell more products or different products into different marketplaces or to come up with new products. Now, if you think about that process, you think about, okay, let's try and get an aligned product to the marketplace. Let's say that perhaps one of my ambitions is that I want to have a single product portfolio for my clients to have a look at, because there's massive complementarity between what I sell and what the business I'm buying is selling. What does that mean? What does that actually require? It's clearly not just a function of the product area to get that sorted. It is a function of sales and marketing. It's a function of R&D. It might even be a function to some extent of the way that the KPIs are set up for our individuals. So there is an HR role in that. There might be a finance role in terms of how we get the MI together for that process. So the ambition of getting a single product portfolio into the marketplace is a combination of lots and lots of different functional expertise under one particular hat. So that becomes a really important thing. The second thing is the new thinking. So this is what David and I have always called the sort of children of the integration. So one of the exciting things about an integration process is that you find all sorts of opportunities that weren't set out in the business case, that weren't set out in the early stage of the process. And that comes through the interaction between people who are engaged and willing to talk to each other. So when you sit two R&D departments down, it's remarkable how quickly they can align themselves around a new product they want to issue to the marketplace, a new way of doing things, a new way of operating. And that generates this new set of thinking. And if you can think about the excitement of an organization that when it comes up with a new plan, a new idea, based on its interaction between it, all those other things that you might be concerned about in the integration process rapidly disappear as we get excited about that. Priorities. So one of the joys about outcome-based program structures is that it becomes very obvious to see where the priorities should be. So our little pet projects, like the HR information system, rapidly disappears as it becomes very obvious that it's not really going to deliver much value in the process, and we should be focusing elsewhere. And the last thing, and this shouldn't be the last thing, but it really often it is described as the last thing, is that aligning communications and purpose in these sort of very broad streams is much, much easier than it is in a series of 27 different streams. I was recently involved in a transaction which had 27 work streams assigned to it. And just as a little byproduct, for those of you who are involved in project and program management, you will understand the complexity of running dependencies. When I pointed out to the designers of this structure that the volume of dependencies between work streams was going to be totally unmanageable, they suggested that we should have a half-an-hour meeting to discuss that, which suggested to me that they didn't really have a clue about how to run projects of this sort of size and scale. And as we all know, dependencies are what kill you. In this process, the expectation. It's not about how does Salesforce interact with how does Salesforce interact with the ERP. It's the actual individual bits of wiring that sit below that you need to engage with from a dependency point of view, and those things can rapidly run out of become a major issue for you. Okay, that's my case.
Yes. So Ben, let me ask you, particularly in large global organizations, but even in smaller ones, mutually based ones, most org structures are functionally based. So the staff you're dealing with all are assigned to a function. Who are the people you're going to use in these cross-functional teams that are going to work on these programs in this way?
Well, what's fascinating is that after a little bit of resistance, where they don't quite know how they're going to refit back into their functions. Those individuals are unbelievably excited about getting involved in transactions where they can see a broader perspective on. So I've never had an issue getting people involved in an integration process coming out of functions. In fact, sometimes the issue is more, okay, so what am I going to do? So if I'm a mid-level HR specialist in an organization, what am I going to do if I get involved in this product design piece? You know, actually pointing them towards the fact that they've got a really significant job to do around KPIs. Perhaps that might be a thing to think about, is, you know, how are we going to redesign the KPIs for the organization, for this part of the organization, to reflect this new way of operating, or how would that might have an impact on you know, the way that we pay people. That starts to become a really interesting conversation, because they are then surrounded by people who've got a very significant opinion. They've got a view of what that should look like, and they're getting a real engagement in the process. So the issue is not necessarily the individuals at a lower level. The issues often at a more senior level, where I'm saying to a function lead, your role in this is going to be determined by the sponsor of this particular outcome-based activity. It's not going to be determined by you, right? So you, HR director, have got a really significant role to play in this piece, but actually your role is as an enabling function for your organization. And
that sounds quite challenging.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
And is this just a short-term thing where you bring people together for the integration to work this way? Is it kind of like a short-term fix, and then people will go back to their functional kind of organizations afterwards?
Well, that's how I sell it. The reality is probably that if it works, that the organization might actually change permanently into much more of an awareness around outcome-based activity. And I do think part of the reason why I do this is because you can have a material impact on the way the organization worked in a BAU environment as well. It seems to me that the employee experience and the result of operating this way leads to this alignment of purpose and clarity of direction in the organization. And that's a very attractive thing for many organizations, I would say.
Definitely. I mean, for me, this has wider impacts in terms of all kind of transformation programs in corporates, where, you know, just with some recent clients, you see their strategy structure and how it splits the portfolio of different programs, and each one individually delivers no benefit. And then the problem is you've got to try and actually coordinate them to actually get some kind of benefit to the business, which isn't an easy thing. Actually, it's much better, exactly as you say, to kind of restructure things to say, okay, this is the short-term benefit we do there. Let's bring together people to deliver this benefit, rather than to deliver one element that was going to be needed to come together with other pieces. Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. So the next one is tablets of stone. The starting point for any post-deal plan is going to be the business case that comes through, or the acquisition case through the pre-deal stage. It's usually very detailed. Typically, it will be looking forward maybe 5 years, maybe even 7 years. And it will probably be extremely detailed down to the nearest dollar for every single line of revenue and every single cost. And that makes complete sense. You need to do your due diligence, and you need to justify to the shareholders where you see value. That then goes into the post-merger integration. And for decades, you know, I was telling people the most important thing you do is start off with this blueprint, which defines actually at the start of the program, turns the business case into that definition of what you're going to achieve. Let's get the management team together, align them around goals. Let's move from the planning stage. You know, we spent months doing the pre-deal activity. Now let's turn this into action. Let's get everyone to approve what's going to happen, so that actually all that distraction around the deal, they can get back to the business as usual, which has been a real issue for them, this distraction from the deal. And actually, we told the market, as you said earlier, Ben, what we're going to try and achieve. So actually, we need detailed plans to go away and say exactly how we're going to achieve that. So all makes complete sense. The rule around creating a very fixed definition of the business case that you're going to achieve through the integration. Why is that an issue? The problem is really fundamentally that that plan you've come up with, that tablet of stone, that business case, is based on a series of assumptions which are going to be flawed to some degree. You've been working in a high stress environment using data that's been provided to you to your data room, and coming up with these ideas. the reality of the business and how it operates. And actually the opportunities within the business are going to be different from the information they've put in the data room about really how they work to some degree. You then have this issue around your plans are based on this theory that don't match up with the reality. And there are a lot of barriers to actually changing things. The people who have spent all of those long hours in the pre-deal process, telling them they've made effectively a mistake or haven't got things completely right, is hard for them. You then actually, typically you're moving on to a different set of people who are delivering the integration, the specialists who are actually going to make things happen compared to the pre-deal people. Actually, none of those people were consulted or really own or able to put input into what the opportunities were, what the actions should be, what the tasks should be. So there's a lack of ownership. As we said before, opportunities emerge, the children of the integration that you didn't expect pre-deal, and those things become ignored, and that becomes really frustrating for people who see this massive opportunity, maybe revenue growth, maybe product or service based, that actually just isn't a priority for the organization. And then as an integration team, if you do try and do something about this, it takes a lot of effort constantly explaining to the senior leadership why there were errors in the original business case. And that's not a very attractive thing to be saying to the leadership team as an integration team is, guys, you've got this wrong. And my experience of that is it does take a lot of time and effort. Is there a different approach? Yes, we believe there is. If at the start, we can all accept that detailed financial model down to the nearest dollar to a degree is going to be flawed, that creates that opportunity to say, okay, we're willing to consider other things. During that pre-deal process, what you can do is if you can get people to list their assumptions and come up with and list their hypotheses, so that once that you get real access to the target and access to discuss, go through the data with them, get a real understanding of how they're working, you can go through those assumptions, actually work out which ones are correct and which ones actually fundamentally might be flawed, and take that time, even if it's just 1 month after deal completion, to create a new baseline using the people in the target who really understand how it works and the information in the targets. That then gives you the opportunity to jointly recreate plans with the people who understand the business, and they'll get buy-in to that, to the plan. And as we all know, getting buy-in of people who are delivering the actions is so important for a program to be successful. Ben, does that make sense?
It makes sense, David. I suppose it brings a challenge in my head, which is what you're describing to some extent almost challenges the way that due diligence is being done as well, because diligence is clearly set up to some extent to validate that business case. Now, we all might think, again, it's quite sort of functionally led, right? So it's not necessarily hypothesis led. So how do you sort of re-engineer your diligence process to reflect what you're describing?
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, I have found plenty of examples before where actually there's no connection between integration and diligence. Actually, everything that happens in the diligence phase gets forgotten. And actually, I don't like that either. That's a real loss of the understanding of and identification of some opportunities there and risks that need to be addressed and issues that need to be dealt with. So completely forgetting the due diligence phase before integration is great from this point of view. You've got a blank sheet of paper to work from, but actually you're missing a lot of opportunities there. I do think it really does start when you're thinking about it. I suppose it's all about your philosophy for M&A. And thinking, actually, we're not just going to make an acquisition here, but the M&A to be successful is going to be a longer term program of integration and opportunities. And if you start with that kind of concept, actually you can get people to start to say, let's start thinking about the integration now, at the same time we're working through the plans for what we might do with things and coming up with our valuation. That kind of concept, you're right, it does need that kind of that thinking pre-deal.
Second thing, I think I was just going to quick other observation I was going to make on this, which would be worth just chatting to a bit, which is that typically a transaction, certainly a public transaction, is held very tightly in a very small group of people. And in order to get that sort of broad ownership that you're describing, you have to suddenly go from that very tight, exclusive ownership piece to one where the operational folk, the folk who've got responsibility for delivering the benefits, suddenly buy into that process? How do you do that? I mean, that's a challenging process, isn't it, really, to go from that very small to very large engagement?
Yes, and subtle differences, you know, it can be the real small things here, which is when you're engaging with those people, actually you go to them and say, look, for confidentiality reasons or for other reasons, we haven't been able to engage you so far. We understand that's a complete mistake and we really, really need your input now. Actually, just starting from scratch. We've got some, you know, due diligence and data in, but actually we recognize that's flawed. You as our specialist and expert in this area, please can you come up and work with these people and come up with your ideas? And then you say, okay, and then what we'll do is we'll compare them against what we said pre-deal and actually work out, is there anything we've missed? Are there any things we need to address that we hadn't recognized in the deal process? So actually allowing people a bit of space and time and saying, okay, you're now in the lead, you go with things, and actually this pre-deal stuff here is just going to be here to support you, I think gives you that kind of change in mindset.
I think that's right. And I think I suppose my other observation is that shareholders don't really care where the benefit comes from, right? They're not going to get too upset if what you're generating for them is a benefit that might come out of a different activity as opposed to the one that we said that was going to be. And that sort of openness, I think, is probably an important thing to take forward in terms of our general approach to try and improve the way we do this stuff. Okay. Let's
Excellent.
move on.
So Ben, over to you to the victor of the spoils.
To the victor of the spoils. So this is one of my favorite ones. The concept here, if we go to the next slide, David, is that because I, as the acquirer, have access to capital, I have the desire in my management team, and I have a strategic intent, I am naturally a better organization than the one that I'm buying. I'm one that is more successful and has the wherewithal to be able to do that. It also follows consequently I'm deliberately exaggerating here to make a point, but this is pretty much what the thinking is that sits within lots of leadership teams when they go through this, and this is perhaps encouraged by the investment bankers amongst ourselves, that this is the right thing. As a consequence, the target is therefore less capable in terms of not having access to that capital and the desire and the strategic intent, and that therefore the decisions that I make are win or loss. So it's a binary decision process, and they are wholesale. So I'm better not just in one area, I'm better in most areas. And because I'm larger, the actual effort I might be larger, the effort to actually do something that might benefit, that might look more like the target, is going to be significantly more difficult because it's more people changing the way that they operate and think, and more impact on systems and processes. So what's the issue with that? If we go to the next slide, though. What is the issue with that? So the two things are, I think, look, I think all of you who will have worked in an organization know that those statements are ridiculous, right? The reality is that performance and scale are not at all correlated. In fact, in some ways, one might say that we're going through a sort of anti-conglomerate phase at the moment, where organizations of really significant size are starting to divest themselves of subsidiaries and parts of their business, precisely because they're not getting the performance out of those businesses, because it's just not physically possible as a leadership team to drive businesses with very different interests and drivers. The second thing is this concept that strategic intent is the determinant of success is complete nonsense, right? I've written success with 3 S's, which I love, because that is the key point. It's actually execution. I suppose, I've just written a book about this very subject, which is that what really determines success is not the strategic intent that you might have drawn up in some ivory tower somewhere, but it's actually your ability to drive that through. And that, again, is not a reflection of size and scale. It's a reflection of really clear leadership and drive and intent, and we'll get to some of that in a minute. And the final thing is this concept that because we're big, we're complex, complexity sits in organizations at every level because precisely of one very simple thing, which is full of people. So complexity is not driven by scale; it's driven by the fact that we as individuals are making life challenging for ourselves. Small businesses have complexity because they are very informal in the way that they work. Relationships exist, and those drive the performance of the business. Complexity sits in large organizations because of the sort of matrix nature of the way that they report and how they operate together. So complexity is there no matter what the size and scale is. And that, again, is part of the challenge and interesting part of integration. If you think about what David's just said about the diligence process, and indeed the job description process, I would struggle to find a small business or a large business where job descriptions ultimately capture exactly what's going on in the organization. And indeed, organizational structure equally doesn't really capture that process. So what's the solution? How do we do with this differently, basically? Well, so this is really interesting. So for the acquired business, the only interest they really have is in how the integration is going to work going forward. And capacity, therefore, to deal with that is really significant. I worked on a number of transactions in the UK before I went out to Asia, where we passed the integration approach, the integration effort, and in fact, the integration leadership to the acquired business and to a very senior leader within that acquired business to basically be the caretaker of that exercise. And it was very easy for him to identify people and resources that wanted to get involved in this process. Very often we get the conversation from our acquirers, which is, we've got 25 different things going on at the same time, transformation activities, other change going on. We're going to have to employ an army of externals to come and help us deliver this work. Actually, looking at the acquired business, you suddenly find that that control, that capacity in that business, and it's much more attractive. Part of the thing, it's actually a theme that runs through all of what we've talked about. I think part of the reason why an organization focuses, or an integration will focus on its cost synergies, is precisely because those synergies are drawn up by externals who don't understand the driver of revenue in their organization. They can't possibly understand it as well as the employees in that business. And that tends towards something that they can determine. The second point is interesting, is that, so do I lose control and direction? Well, not necessarily. Actually, all that happens is that we're moving control down the organization to the right level. We still have, excos and steering committee meetings and steer codes where there's proper representation across the business in terms of who's doing what. So the right decisions, the big decisions are made at that senior level, but effectively what you're doing is pushing some of the less material decisions further down into the organization. I will give you my car parking example in a minute. And the final thing is that it generates this speed of decision-making process and generates some decentralization. Some of you will have heard this story. It is my favorite story about making decisions quickly. I was involved in a professional services business integration in the UK many years ago. Lawyers, very smart people, where I was invited to a steering committee meeting with everyone who had a C in their title. The main subject for the steering committee, and this is a chargeable business, so they were spending 3-4 hours of the afternoon talking about this. The main subject on the agenda was how many car parking spaces were required at the new head office building, which seems like a fairly insignificant conversation to have. Anyway, I think they came up after 3 hours of debate with the number 42, which is magical in many ways. And when we when that decision was passed down to the head of sort of infrastructure, he laughed at it and said, "That's ridiculous. I've never had more than 15 people turn up in a car, so let's make it 22." That decision was duly pushed up to the steering committee, and 6 weeks later, that was the decision that was made. Now, this is not the issue about, everyone says that's a ridiculous, how can that possibly be? Those people must be quite stupid. No, they weren't. They were clever people. The problem there was the decision-making structure had basically failed, and the individual who should have been making those decisions wasn't prepared to do that. And the consequences are much greater than the sort of time effort around that. If you think that that took 6 weeks, that process, if I'm an employee of that business, if I'm a junior lawyer, or even if I'm a senior lawyer and I'm not involved in the exercise, what does that say to me? Does that say to me, oh, look, I've actually got some really significant problems here around which clients I can continue to market to, about conflicts of interest. And you senior leadership, are making decisions about car parking. It's taking you 6 weeks to make that decision. There's got to be a fundamental problem in our business. A slight distraction, interesting story that I tell frequently about how to avoid this problem. So there is capacity and there is alignment of interest in the business that you've bought. And it is really important to think about those two components in the context of how do we staff up and make the right decisions with regard to the integration. David.
So Ben, one question from me, and it's fundamentally based in, you and I love to ground what we're doing in research where possible. So, behavioral economics, behavioral science, where we're actually really understanding how people behave rather than the prior thinking. If you think about 20, 30 years ago, case studies based on, thoughts about how people might behave rather than real reality. I just went to get my cards here about the kind of classic biases, and you look at all of them, they're all based around in-group bias, where you favour people close to you who you know more, the extrinsic incentive error, ultimate attribution error, out-group homogeneity bias, group attribution error, illusion of validity. Zero-sum bias. There's so many behavioural biases and heuristics that we have embedded in how we think that forces people in the target to say, actually, the people I know and trust and I work with are fundamentally different in how they think and act from the people I'm acquiring. How do you get over that?
Well, so, you're absolutely right. That's exactly where a lot of this decision making comes from, right? But we also know what the solution to that, which is that lots and lots of interaction. It comes back to my point at the start, which is that we need to have integration. We need to have lots and lots of conversations. And we'll get to culture in a minute. But if we have more and more conversations with our colleagues, the more we understand that they don't actually have, horns and a tail. They are actually quite sensible people, and that they, in fact, perhaps talk our own language. You and I went through a number of processes recently, through sort of discovery workshop process, where the discovery that two sets of very senior, very experienced, highly technical analysts within their business actually had respect for each other and were prepared to therefore work together, was the defining moment in that exercise. And I think it's that level of discussion that generates this understanding that actually they are sensible people, and we can work together and we can start to build that capability. But I think fundamentally, there needs to be an understanding that I'm not just buying an asset, I'm buying a set of people that have competed effectively in the marketplace. I'm buying this business because they were good at what they were doing, right? And losing that capability, or creating this sort of binary decision-making process about that capability is just a big mistake, in my view.
Fantastic. Well, that takes us on nicely to the final one, Ben, for you, which is culture.
Let's talk about culture, my favorite conversation in the discussion. So here's our agile gorilla. He's not very agile in this one, he's very large. And obviously this points to the fact that the big gorilla in the room, the 600-pound gorilla in the room in most in transactions, is culture. And the unwritten rules on this, if we go to the next slide, and these are just a set of quotes that I've directly heard from people, and implications that sit behind it, right? If the CEOs get on, we should all be fine. So often culture diagnostic is basically driven by a dinner that the two CEOs had beforehand, where they seem to get on really well, and their wives got on, the husbands got on really well, and we had a bottle of wine or two together, and we seem to be fine, so we'll be okay. A look at our values, we've got them written on our walls. The stonemasons have been engaged to write our values, they represent our culture. Guess what? They've got integrity, and we've got integrity as part of ours. We're therefore the same. lots of discussions around measuring culture. It's too difficult. How do you do it? It's very qualitative. Can you really measure this stuff? Then when there's a bit of understanding, sometimes we get to the point that, you know, it's actually not really about us as leaders in this business, it's about our employee base that needs to change. And then finally, the great sort of let's not disrupt perspective, which we hear all the time. In fact, I still hear it with people. Let's not engage the poor things. You know, they've got enough to worry about. They're really uncertain about stuff. And if we give them too much to worry about, then they're going to stop doing what they're supposed to be doing. They trust us and they know that we have their best interests at heart, is the sort of core behind that process. So these are the assumptions behind culture, and why culture is not important, or why culture can be challenging. And I suppose our hypothesis here is that changing corporate culture is something that that can be done and should be done. And I suppose what we're challenging here is that corporate culture is as much part of the DNA and the value of a business as its assets, its client base, and everything else. It might not be material. It might not materialize into the terms of the P&L of the business. You might not see a little line item that the accountant puts out there, which says this is what the corporate culture or value of our business is. I would argue that that line item actually does exist, and it's called goodwill. But you know, it's very rare that you'll get an accountant to agree with me on that perspective. So there is a challenge here, which is changing company culture is a bit like changing anything else in an organization that has actual real value. You have to be very careful with that process. If we go on to the next slide, David. So what do we want to do? If you do want to have an impact on culture, we need to be really aware of what we're trying to do here. And the first thing is that culture change, as we all know, is not driven by just the leadership, right? It's driven by everyone in the organization. If you imagined, the great analogy that I was starting to come to was that if you imagined that you were going to change the corporate language of your organization, that's a really interesting proxy for thinking about culture change. Because the more you think about that challenge, the more you start to recognize how big it is and how significant it is. So it's not just about everyone, say we're moving from English to Spanish, it's not about just everyone learning the new language. That's obviously a big significant issue and challenge for us. The languages are related, so everyone will speak a little bit of Spanish because they speak a bit of English, right? So that's not too crazy. But then let's think about the signage, let's think about the technology, let's think about the customers, let's think about how we engage with our customers, let's think about our supply chain. So this is not something that just happens at the top of the business. You're not just going to change the organization from English to Spanish at leadership and expect everyone else to get on with it. You're going to expect the whole organization to have to do that process. And changing corporate culture is something that has to impact on everyone. The second one is optics. So if you are going to start to try and align corporate culture, the optics become really, really important. So what do I mean by optics? I mean, you know, I recently worked in a client where there were two halves to this business, and the two halves were not very integrated. And in fact, what was interesting is that the marketplace, the way they pitched themselves to the marketplace was they were entirely integrated, but in fact the reality is they didn't like each other very much, or let's say the leadership didn't like each other very much and didn't want to really play together. And when I went into their building, it was fascinating how this was signposted. The two halves were on two different floors in the organization. And what was even more brilliant was that the access, you know, your key card access, if you were sitting on floor 2, you didn't have access to floor 3, and vice versa. Now, how brilliant is that as an optic for showing a lack of integration between the organizations? So those optics are really, really important. So when we start to think about, you know, an organization that needs to become more collaborative, maybe that's something that we say, you know, part of our corporate company culture is that, you know, as a result of our fantastic work with David and Ben, we are now an organization that's not so functionally led, we're much more outcome driven, basically. And that requires collaboration across the organization. Okay, but okay, that's great. But does my senior leadership still sit in offices with doors that are firmly closed. Does that feel like a collaborative environment? Probably not, right? So if I remove those offices and those doors for those senior leaders in that organization, what happens then? Does that maybe signal to my employee base that I'm starting to think a bit more about collaboration? So those optics are really, really critical. Changing leadership behavior has a multiplier effect. So this is really important. If we can persuade leaders to change the way that they operate, the signpost that generates in the organization is absolutely massive. It's one of those things that where you can see the ripple effect really quickly and really dramatically. Everyone talks about changing corporate culture as being a long-term exercise. I can tell you my experience is very different. It can be really fast if you can change the way that leaders think about the way that they operate, and visibly change the way that they think about stuff. Just think about our dress policies over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, 6 years, where organizations have gone from, wearing suits and ties to wearing shirts and casual wear. That was largely driven, and you can see how a leader, if they change the way that they look, is going to have a very dramatic impact. Changing corporate culture, if you're going to do it, is about role modeling. It's not about PowerPoint. If I sat down with this group of people in a room for an hour or two and took them through a 25-point slide presentation, do you think that would change culture? Not at all. If, on the other hand, I, as a leader in the organization, change the way that I engage with people. So for example, if I want to flatten the organization, if I want to get innovative thinking coming through the organization, if I specifically in a meeting focus on the most junior people in that meeting to come up with their ideas and encourage them to do that, that is going to be much more dramatic in terms of the effect it has on the organizational culture than going through 25 of the best slides that I've written. And then finally, you've got to measure it. And you can measure it. It's something that we can have a conversation about, but you can absolutely measure it. So there you are. There's my case
Ben,
for company culture. Yes.
I love that. Roy Sutherland talks about being the small things being so important really well in some TED Talks, which are great. And you talk about optics there. So let's say I'm now been appointed as integration manager for an integration program, and I know this stuff is important. How do I go about telling the leadership of the organization that all those detailed plans I've got about process changes and system changes, we also need to do all these small things that are about optics? Surely that's a really hard conversation to have with the CEO or the board of an organization, to say they need to change their behaviors. How do you go about doing that?
It's a really good question. It depends a bit on your relationship with your senior leaders, and sometimes that's why an external gets employed, is because they can actually have that conversation, and it's not necessarily career threatening for the individual if they have that conversation. So that sometimes is a good role for an external to get involved in. It requires an external that's a bit brave, because obviously they also have a conflict of interest in telling it how it is. So they have to be a bit brave about it. The second way to do this is to start to generate some really powerful data. So part of the diagnostic exercise is to go and talk. Surprise, surprise, learning about your corporate culture isn't about looking at the values on the wall. It's actually going to talk to the employees in the organization and find out what their real experience is of what's going on there. And when those senior leaders are confronted with the fact that an organization isn't working too well, or there's some issues, or there's some things that need to be resolved that will help unblock perhaps that innovation, that change capability in the business, that becomes a much harder thing to ignore. I think the third thing is that often people think that culture change is about sort of one massive change, one sort of silver bullet that they need to go through. And sometimes you just need to point them towards the fact there are small steps that they can take. You and I have both been rugby coaches, and we all know that the getting people to tackle is not really about the physical act. It's about taking a step forward in that process. A single step forward is much more likely to result in a good result for the individual concerned. So, taking the doors off an office, getting people to ask different questions, almost signposting those different questions that they're going to ask in those meetings, going into a comms process, unprepared, not having the 25 slides that you've normally had, which people get bored with and start falling asleep by, but actually just doing a Q&A process, and almost setting up that Q&A process really early on, so that when a CEO goes into a room with 25 people, he's sitting on the corner, she's sitting on the corner of a desk and is prepared to answer anything. Those are really simple exercises, and you'll find people are really good at this stuff, right? It's not like it's something that they struggle with. It's just they've been sort of pigeonholed into certain ways of operating. So those sort of comms fora are really powerful. Roberto Rites, the guy that I interviewed for Nextel, who was a case study that I've written about relatively recently, talked about that the fact that communications was something like 70 or 80% of his effort on a monthly basis. That's how he dedicated his time. And you could see that in that process, he starts to generate change. In that process, he starts to engage with people in a different way and push through. We are at the end of our formal bit, I think, David. I'm going to pass to Feriani briefly to talk a bit about IMAA, and then we're going to go into the Q&A session, and I'm expecting lots of fantastic questions from you all.
All right, thank you so much, Ben, for your sharing, and I will take over from here. Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Friani from IMAA Singapore office. So let me share with you on our training programs of what Ben and David were sharing earlier. It was part of our IMAA and also on our certificate in post-merger integrations. So these two certificates courses are available under IBF funding for Singaporean and PR. And if you are self-sponsored, again, I would like to share the good news. You can use your skills future credit to offset the co-payment of the unfunded portions. So next, I will go to, let me go to my next slide. Sorry. These are our course fees, which is we are offered in the three different learning methodologies, which is on the online. Our course fees is at 4,100 Singapore dollars before funding. And please take note of the training hours is total of 75 hours for the IMAA certificate experts. And for the virtual classrooms, the course fees is at 5,400 and the CPD hours is 32.5. And I will also share with you on our upcoming virtual class schedules for the Singapore participants. And the on-site one, as what Alex had shared earlier in the beginning of the presentation, it's going to happen in September 2022, which is right before the completion deadline of the IBF funding for this year 2022 funding quantum. So a part of IMAA expert certificate, we also offer a certified post-merger integration specialist. And the course fees is also about the same, except for the on-site classroom, there's a slight difference, which is 6,750 Singapore dollars before funding. And last but not least, we are happy to provide the financial modeling and business valuation courses. And this is applicable only for the participants that are company sponsored from the fintech or the FI industries. So these are our upcoming virtual training schedule that are eligible for the IBF STS funding scheme. So if you're working in Singapore and in other industries, you are not necessary to work in the financial industries or the fintech industries. Yes, you are eligible for STS funding schemes. So for the upcoming virtual class, it will be on 2nd to 13th of May. And the time is from 7 p.m. to 10:15 p.m. Singapore time. It's from Monday to Friday, yes. And there will be exams, which is the schedule of the exams will be 2 weeks after the last day of the class. So we're also going to run our second run of financial modeling and business valuation course. And it's going to take place in July 2022. So I will share with you also on the confirmed date once I have the confirmation from our trainers. And the time-wise, it's going to be from 7 p.m. to 10:15 p.m. Singapore time as well. And here we have the QR code. If you scan and also share with me your details, I'm happy to share with you on the updates of the M&A's activities and also on our IMAA's programs. And also, if you have any questions or if you'd like to register for our programs, feel free to write into me as well. And how you can get my email address, I can also share it with you right after the course as well. So that's all for today's presentation from my side. And I think after this, there will be another session of the Q&A. And I will hand over to David and also to Ben.
Fantastic. Thank you, Feryani.
Thank you.
So as you've probably seen from the discussion Ben and I have just had, we think integration programs are just one of the most fascinating things to get involved in terms of you just get involved in whether it's organization structures or culture or goals, vision, through to the detail of an organization, how you conduct process change and system change. There are amazing opportunities to get involved. So if we'd love to hear any questions you've got. Equally, please do join us for the courses that Feryani talked about. We'll go into much more detail about the practical ways of getting this done.
Let's see if we have some questions already. If not, I might ask a question to Ben and David. I mean, we've certainly have touched a lot upon the topic of culture in a transaction process, which I think is of course one of the main issues you are facing in a transaction, whether it's a takeover or a merger of two companies. What have been, and from your experiences, I mean, both of you have been joining a lot of transactions as an external partner, or leading the people by hand, basically. What have been really the biggest obstacles you have faced when you cluster it out? The three biggest obstacles you have faced in a transactional process. It's a tough one, I know, but
I'll start, David. I'll do my first one, and then you go next after that. So the biggest one for me is about culture's a practical thing, right? It's not just a thing that's some sort of airy fairy that sits in the sky. Oh, we all aspire to be this and that. I aspire to be a lot thinner than I actually am, but the reality is that I'm not. Okay, so but the practicalities of culture are, for example, the speed of decision making, as we talked about. How fast does it actually take to make a decision? Now, there's lots of evidence that there's a difference in national cultures between that. Some people like to spend a lot of time talking to each other about making decisions. Other people like to make decisions quickly and then try and persuade other countries like to make decisions really quickly and then try and persuade the employee base to come alongside that process. So so getting to an agreement about how fast we should be responding to something, even something really practical and small, is a cultural discussion, right? Because it's something where you either have to divest some responsibility, right, to the people who are in the right space, so that it doesn't have to escalate all the way up to the top of the organization to get to the right decision, right? Or you have to convene those senior people at a really regular basis and get them to focus on the key things that need to be decided. Those two are the only ways that you can really achieve that. And it's very, when you go to a client and say, listen, we can't spend the next 3 weeks. If we decide that we want to go quickly, we can't spend the next 3 weeks talking about what what the entry pass policy should be, or how many holidays we need to have, or two really important things like what's the brand going to be, right? We need to make those decisions together, collectively, in a single forum, and we need to be comfortable with that process that we're following, because then we're sending a signal to the organization about how this is going to work going forward, and this is how we're going to make decisions, right?
That's a good point. For me, the easiest integrations I've done and got involved with, and also probably the most rewarding, are the ones where actually there's a general recognition that it is distressed. Things have materially gone wrong. Management understand that. The organization understands that. And then there's a real appetite to try things differently. The challenge is the perceived thinking about how you go about M&A integration is so pervasive. Every management consultancy uses the same methodology that embeds all of the things that Ben and I have been talking about. Actually saying you need to do this differently, otherwise these are the unintended consequences, just is hard for an organization to accept. It's much safer for them to do what they think everyone else is doing, and actually failing but using the agreed process is better for them than having the opportunity to succeed and do things differently. So finding the most challenging element for me is always finding that opportunity where we can say, okay, here's the thing that's going wrong. We can use this as a lever to change how things are done.
Okay. And how do you go about? I mean, we have not received any questions so far, but I have another one. How do you go about? You both of you, of course, mentioned the importance of the leadership, really kind of both institutions really working on this together, and then getting their heads together, and trying to make this work for both organizations, or as both organizations become one. When that doesn't work, when the chemistry is not there at all between those leaders, how do you handle these kind of issues usually? Or what are kind of methodologies how you can kind of handle that?
I suppose at one point, I'll hand that over to Ben. If I could jump in first and say, I think just when we often talk about leadership, it's not just the people who are at the top of the organization. What I clarify is that the people who are really acting as leaders of the organization, the people with status and authenticity. And that might be the technical person. It might be the person who's leading customer support. These key people who are recognized in the organization as kind of cultural ambassadors or leaders, they really shape how things are done. So when we think about leadership, we need to think about the wider context, not just the board. But Ben, what were you going to say?
Well, I was exactly going to make that point, which is that it's very easy to get caught up in the hierarchy of an organization. The reality is identifying those that sit deep down in the business that really make a huge difference. And it's not hard, right, to identify those people. Alex, if I talked to you about IMAA and I said to you, right, well, does Chris Kummer, does he really exert all that control? Is he really at the top of the pyramid? You'd probably say, well, yeah, but actually there's 4 or 5 other people in this organization that are much more important because they've either got client responsibility or because they've got a voice or for whatever else reason. And that's in a small organization like IMAA, right? We're talking about big organizations. If I sat down with, and I've done it many times with my colleagues in Singapore, I've sat down with people and I've said to them in clients, and I've said to them, right, you give me the 10 names in your organization that I need to talk to that are really going to influence change. It's remarkable how consistent you get to the same names. And guess what? I'll let you into a secret. They're often not at the top of the business. Now, if I start to influence those people, I bring them into the process. And the way I bring them into the process is by asking them lots of questions, right? It's really simple. Everyone's prepared to give them information, right? David and I are sitting here spending an hour and a half this morning having a lovely time talking to you guys, precisely because we feel that we have something to contribute to this process, right? Those people are the same. They feel like they can contribute to the process. So asking them lots of questions about how we should be doing things, what things we should be thinking about in terms of the integration portfolio activities, what things we should be thinking about that are really going wrong or that could be changed, what we should be trying to influence. Those are really interesting questions for them to ask and to engage with. And what happens then is that they start to get excited about the process. They start to see their words and their ideas penetrate into the way the integrations go. They become advocates. And because they have such influence, those around them also then become advocates. One of my colleagues has just sent me a text recently saying, I'm doing the thing that I do a lot, which is I speak too fast. And one of my clients in the Philippines recently said to me that, not recently, a while ago, said to me that I spoke so fast that I gave her a nosebleed. So I apologize, but when I get excited about these things, I tend to do that.
Thanks, Ben. We actually got a question from Juwali. How can we capture greater value in the due diligence process, since considerable amount of effort and time are usually put into it?
That's a good question.
Good question, yeah.
So let me start, David, you can jump in. So first and foremost, we need to recognize there are 2 types of diligence. There's a commodity-based diligence, which is all the sort of stuff that you've got to do, right? Finance and HR, they've got responsibilities from a legal point of view to ask certain questions around that area. But do not mistake that for and insight into the organization. The second part of the diligence process, which is much more important, and it might go beyond, you know, an announcement day, if you like, is the hypothesis-driven exercise. Why are we buying this business? And you can usually capture it in 4 or 5 reasons. And what am I therefore doing in a diligence process to confirm or otherwise that those are those opportunities actually exist within that process? It's not hard to do. Again, it involves professionals from each of these functions working together to identify the answers, then the response to that process. You know, my hypothesis is that I will be able to sell my products through their customer practice. How do I confirm that A, they've got the right relationships in place, B, that I'm speaking to the right people in the customer base, C, that we're measuring the right thing? Those things are not difficult to articulate in that process. So hypothesis-driven diligence, which is at the heart of any good integration process, has to be a key part of it, and it's different from the commoditized stuff.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
definitely agree with that. What I'd add is, I think there's an opportunity to get greater value from due diligence processes, whether you follow through with the acquisition or not. Actually, if you approach it in the right way during the DD process, and you say, actually, and make it clear to the target, what we're really looking to do is learn from your organization. You know, the management team and the target are usually really keen for this opportunity to share their insight of the market, share their capabilities, you know, talk about what makes them a great business. And there's so much to learn from the business. So using the due diligence process as an additional on top of the kind of basic level, what you need to do is a learning exercise, and sharing those learnings across the deal team actually means you're getting value out of every due diligence process you're going, not just the ones where you complete the transaction.
Great, thanks a lot. Then I think we've reached the time already. Thanks a lot, Ben and David, for your contribution today and these great insights into post-merger integration. If some of the participants have more questions, also regarding due diligence process, this is also a big part of our trainings. We have very much enjoyed the session today, and please do not hesitate to contact and reach out to us. You will get the slides afterwards from IBF. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a nice day.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very, very much for the excellent presentation, David, Ben, and Alexander. We've now come to the end of today's session. Thank you once again for joining us. You may stay connected with us via our Telegram group and our website.
Thank you
We'll see
very
you
much.
soon. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.